Book 2, Chapter 39 of Resurrection. There were still 2 hours before the passenger train by which Nekhludoff was going would start. He had thought of using this interval to see his sister again, but after the impressions of the morning he felt much excited and so done up that, sitting down on the sofa in the first-class refreshment room, he suddenly grew so drowsy that he turned over onto his side and, laying his face on his hand, fell asleep at once. A waiter in a dress coat with a napkin in his hand woke him. Sir, are you not Prince Nekhludoff? There's a lady looking for you." Nekhludoff started up and recollected where he was and all that had happened in the morning. He saw in his imagination the procession of prisoners, the dead bodies, the railway carriages with barred windows, and the women locked up in them, one of whom was groaning in travail with no one to help her, and another who was pathetically smiling at him through the bars. The reality before his eyes was very different, i.e., a table with vases, candlesticks and crockery, and agile waiters moving round the table, and in the background a cupboard and a counter laden with fruit and bottles, behind it a barman, and in front the backs of passengers who had come up for refreshments. When Nekhludoff had risen and sat gradually collecting his thoughts, he noticed that everybody in the room was inquisitively looking at something that was passing by the open doors. He also looked and saw a group of people carrying a chair on which sat a lady whose head was wrapped in a kind of airy fabric. Nekhludoff thought he knew the footman who was supporting the chair in front, and also the man behind, and a doorkeeper with gold cord on his cap seemed familiar. A lady's maid with a fringe and an apron, who was carrying a parcel, a parasol, and something round in a leather case, was walking behind the chair. Then came Prince Korchagin, with his thick lips, apoplectic neck, and a travelling cap on his head. Behind him Missy, her cousin Misha, and an acquaintance of Nekhludoff's, the long-necked diplomat Osten, with his protruding Adam's apple and his unvarying merry mood and expression. He was saying something very emphatically, though jokingly, to the smiling Missy. The Korchagins were moving from their estate near the city to the estate of the Princess's sister on the Nijni railway. The procession, the men carrying the chair, the maid, and the doctor, vanished into the ladies' waiting room, evoking a feeling of curiosity and respect in the onlookers. But the old prince remained and sat down at the table, called a waiter, and ordered food and drink. Missy and Osten also remained in the refreshment room, and were about to sit down when they saw an acquaintance in the doorway and went up to her. It was Natalie Rogozinsky. Natalie came into the refreshment room, accompanied by Agrafena Petrovna, and both looked around the room. Natalie noticed at one and the same moment both her brother and Missy. She first went up to Missy, only nodding to her brother, but having kissed her, at once turned to him. "At last I have found you," she said. Nekhludoff rose to greet Missy, Misha, and Osten, and to say a few words to them. Missy told him about their house in the country having been burnt down, which necessitated their moving to her aunt's. Osten began relating a funny story about a fire. Nekhludoff paid no attention and turned to his sister. "How glad I am that you have come." "I have been here a long time," she said. "Agrafena Petrovna is with me," and she pointed to Agrafena Petrovna, who, in a waterproof and with a bonnet on her head, stood some way off, and bowed to him with kindly dignity and some confusion, not wishing to intrude. "We looked for you everywhere." "And I had fallen asleep here. How glad I am that you have come," repeated Nekhludoff. "I had begun to write to you." "Really?" she said, looking frightened. "What about?" Missy and the gentleman, noticing that an intimate conversation was about to commence between the brother and sister, went away. Nekhludoff and his sister sat down by the window on a velvet-covered sofa, on which lay a plaid, a box, and a few other things. "Yesterday, after I left you, I felt inclined to return and express my regret, but I did not know how he would take it," said Nekhludoff. "I spoke hastily to your husband, and this tormented me." "I knew," said his sister, "that you did not mean to. Oh, you know," and the tears came to her eyes, and she touched his hand. The sentence was not clear, but he understood it perfectly, and was touched by what it expressed. Her words meant that, besides the love for her husband, which held her in its sway, she prized and considered important the love she had for him, her brother, and that every misunderstanding between them caused her deep suffering. Thank you. Oh, what I have seen to-day!" he said, suddenly recalling the second of the dead convicts. "2 prisoners have been done to death." "Done to death? How?" "Yes, done to death. They led them in this heat, and 2 died of sunstroke." "Impossible! What, to-day? Just now?" "Yes, just now. I have seen their bodies." "But why done to death? Who killed them?" asked Nathalie. "They who forced them to go killed them," said Nekhludoff with irritation, feeling that she looked at this too with her husband's eyes. "Oh, Lord!" said Agrafena Petrovna, who had come up to them. "Yes, we have not the slightest idea of what is being done to these unfortunate beings, but it ought to be known," added Nekhludoff, and looked at old Korchagin, who sat with a napkin tied round him and a bottle before him, and who looked round at Nekhludoff. "Nekhludoff," he called out, "won't you join me and take some refreshment? It is excellent before a journey." Nekhludoff refused and turned away. "But what are you going to do?" Nathalie continued. "What I can. I don't know, but I feel I must do something, and I shall do what I am able to." "Yes, I understand. And how about them?" she continued, with a smile and a look towards Korchagin. "Is it possible that it is all over?" "Completely, and I think without any regret on either side." "It is a pity. I am sorry. I am fond of her. However, it's all right. But why do you wish to bind yourself?" she added shyly. "Why are you going?" "I go because I must," answered Nekhludoff seriously and dryly, as if wishing to stop this conversation. But he felt ashamed of his coldness towards his sister at once. "Why not tell her all I am thinking?" he thought, "and let Agrafena Petrovna also hear it," he thought, with a look at the old servant, whose presence made the wish to repeat his decision to his sister even stronger. "You mean my intention to marry Katusha? Well, you see, I made up my mind to do it, but she refuses, definitely and firmly," he said, and his voice shook, as it always did when he spoke of it. "She does not wish to accept my sacrifice, but is herself sacrificing what in her position means much, and I cannot accept this sacrifice, if it is only a momentary impulse. And so I am going with her, and shall be where she is, and shall try to lighten her fate as much as I can." Nathalie said nothing. Agrafena Petrovna looked at her with a questioning look and shook her head. At this moment the former procession issued from the ladies' room. The same handsome footman, Philip, and the doorkeeper were carrying the Princess Korchagin. She stopped the men who were carrying her and motioned to Nekhludoff to approach, and with a pitiful, languishing air she extended her white ringed hand, expecting the firm pressure of his hand with a sense of horror. "Épouvantable," she said, meaning the heat. "I cannot stand it. Ce climat me tue." And after a short talk about the horrors of the Russian climate, she gave the men a sign to go on. "Be sure and come," she added, turning her long face towards Nekhludoff as she was borne away. The procession with the princes turned to the right towards the first-class carriages. Nekhludoff, with the porter who was carrying his things, and Taras with his bag, turned to the left. "This is my companion," said Nekhludoff to his sister, pointing to Taras, whose story he had told her before. "Surely not third class?" said Nathalie, when Nekhludoff stopped in front of the third-class carriage, and Taras and the porter with the things went in. "Yes, it is more convenient for me to be with Taras," he said. "One more thing," he added. "Up to now I have not given the Kousminski land to the peasants, so that, in case of my death, your children will inherit it." "Dmitri, don't," said Nathalie. "If I do give it away, all I can say is that the rest will be theirs, as it is not likely I shall marry, and if I do marry I shall have no children, so that—" "Dmitri, don't talk like that," said Nathalie, and yet Nekhludoff noticed that she was glad to hear him say it. Higher up, by the side of a first-class carriage, there stood a group of people still looking at the carriage into which the Princess Korchagin had been carried. Most of the passengers were already seated. Some of the late-comers hurriedly clattered along the boards of the platform. The guard was closing the doors and asking the passengers to get in, and those who were seeing them off to come out. Nekhludoff entered the hot, smelling carriage, but at once stepped out again onto the small platform at the back of the carriage. Nathalie stood opposite the carriage, with her fashionable bonnet and cape, by the side of Agrafena Petrovna, and was evidently trying to find something to say. She could not even say écrivez, because they had long ago laughed at this word, habitually spoken by those about to part. The short conversation about money matters had in a moment destroyed the tender brotherly and sisterly feelings that had taken hold of them. They felt estranged, so that Nathalie was glad when the train moved, and she could only say, nodding her head with a sad and tender look, "Good-bye, good-bye, Dmitri." But as soon as the carriage had passed her, she thought of how she should repeat her conversation with her brother to her husband, and her face became serious and troubled. Nekhludoff, too, though he had nothing but the kindest feelings for his sister, and had hidden nothing from her, now felt depressed and uncomfortable with her, and was glad to part. He felt that the Nathalie who was once so near to him no longer existed, and in her place was only a slave of that hairy, unpleasant husband who was so foreign to him. He saw it clearly when her face lit up with peculiar animation as he spoke of what would peculiarly interest her husband, i.e., the giving up of the land to the peasants and the inheritance, and this made him sad. End of Book 2, Chapter 39. Book 2, Chapter 40 of Resurrection. The heat in the large third-class carriage, which had been standing in the burning sun all day, was so great that Nekhludoff did not go in, but stopped on the little platform behind the carriage, which formed a passage to the next one. But there was not a breath of fresh air here either, and Nekhludoff breathed freely only when the train had passed the buildings and the draught blew across the platform. "Yes, killed," he repeated to himself, the words he had used to his sister, and in his imagination, in the midst of all other impressions, there arose with wonderful clearness the beautiful face of the second dead convict, with the smile of the lips, the severe expression of the brows, and the small, firm ear below the shaved, bluish skull. And what seemed terrible was that he had been murdered, and no one knew who had murdered him. Yet he had been murdered. He was led out like all the rest of the prisoners by Maslenikov's orders. Maslenikov had probably given the order in the usual manner, had signed with his stupid flourish the paper with the printed heading, and most certainly would not consider himself guilty. Still less would the careful doctor who examined the convicts consider himself guilty. He had performed his duty accurately and had separated the weak. How could he have foreseen this terrible heat, or the fact that they would start so late in the day and in such crowds? The prison inspector? But the inspector had only carried into execution the order that on a given day a certain number of exiles and convicts, men and women, had to be sent off. The convoy officer could not be guilty either, for his business was to receive a certain number of persons in a certain place, and to deliver up the same number. He conducted them in the usual manner, and could not foresee that two such strong men as those Nekhludoff saw would not be able to stand it and would die. No one is guilty, and yet the men have been murdered by these people who are not guilty of their murder. All this comes, Nekhludoff thought, from the fact that all these people, governors, inspectors, police officers, and men, consider that there are circumstances in which human relations are not necessary between human beings. All these men, Maslenikov and the inspector and the convoy officer, if they were not governor, inspector, officer, would have considered 20 times before sending people in such heat, in such a mass, would have stopped 20 times on the way, and, seeing that a man was growing weak, gasping for breath, would have led him into the shade, would have given him water and let him rest, and if an accident had still occurred, they would have expressed pity. But they not only did not do it, but hindered others from doing it, because they considered not men and their duty towards them, but only the office they themselves filled, and held what that office demanded of them to be above human relations. That's what it is, Nekhludoff went on in his thoughts. If one acknowledges, but for a single hour, that anything can be more important than love for one's fellow men, even in some one exceptional case, any crime can be committed without a feeling of guilt. Nekhludoff was so engrossed by his thoughts that he did not notice how the weather changed. The sun was covered over by a low-hanging, ragged cloud. A compact, light grey cloud was rapidly coming from the west, and was already falling in heavy, driving rain on the fields and woods far in the distance. Moisture coming from the cloud mixed with the air. Now and then the cloud was rent by flashes of lightning, and peals of thunder mingled more and more often with the rattling of the train. The cloud came nearer and nearer. The raindrops, driven by the wind, began to spot the platform and Nekhludoff's coat, and he stepped to the other side of the little platform, and, inhaling the fresh, moist air, filled with the smell of corn and wet earth that had long been waiting for rain, he stood looking at the gardens, the woods, the yellow rye fields, the green oat fields, the dark green strips of potatoes in bloom that glided past. Everything looked as if covered over with varnish. The green turned greener, the yellow yellower, the black blacker. "More, more," said Nekhludoff, gladdened by the sight of gardens and fields revived by the beneficent shower. The shower did not last long. Part of the cloud had come down in rain. Part passed over, and the last fine drops fell straight on to the earth. The sun reappeared. Everything began to glisten, and in the east, not very high above the horizon, appeared a bright rainbow, with the violet tint very distinct and broken only at one end. "Why, what was I thinking about?" Nekhludoff asked himself when all these changes in nature were over, and the train ran into a cutting between two high banks. "Oh, I was thinking that all those people, inspector, convoy men, all those in the service, are for the greater part kind people, cruel only because they are serving." He recalled Maslenikov's indifference when he told him about what was being done in the prison, the inspector's severity, the cruelty of the convoy officer when he refused places on the carts to those who asked for them, and paid no attention to the fact that there was a woman in travail in the train. All these people were evidently invulnerable and impregnable to the simplest feelings of compassion only because they held offices. As officials they were impermeable to the feelings of humanity as this paved ground is impermeable to the rain. Thus thought Nekhludoff as he looked at the railway embankment paved with stones of different colours, down which the water was running in streams instead of soaking into the earth. Perhaps it is necessary to pave the banks with stones, but it is sad to look at the ground, which might be yielding corn, grass, bushes, or trees in the same way as the ground visible up there is doing, deprived of vegetation, and so it is with men, thought Nekhludoff. Perhaps these governors, inspectors, policemen are needed, but it is terrible to see men deprived of the chief human attribute, that of love and sympathy for one another. The thing is, he continued, that these people consider lawful what is not lawful, and do not consider the eternal, immutable law written in the hearts of men by God as law. That is why I feel so depressed when I am with these people. I am simply afraid of them. And really they are terrible, more terrible than robbers. A robber might, after all, feel pity, but they can feel no pity. They are inured against pity as these stones are against vegetation. That is what makes them terrible. It is said that the Pugachevs, the Razins, leaders of rebellions in Russia, Stonka Razin in the 17th and Pugachev in the 18th century, are terrible. These are 1,000 times more terrible, he continued in his thoughts. If a psychological problem were set to find means of making men of our time, Christian, humane, simple, kind people, perform the most horrible crimes without feeling guilty, only one solution could be devised: to go on doing what is being done. It is only necessary that these people should be governors, inspectors, policemen, that they should be fully convinced that there is a kind of business called government service which allows men to treat other men as things without human brotherly relations with them, and also that these people should be so linked together by this government service that the responsibility for the results of their actions should not fall on any one of them separately. Without these conditions the terrible acts I witness today would be impossible in our times. It all lies in the fact that men think there are circumstances in which one may deal with human beings without love. And there are no such circumstances. One may deal with things without love. One may cut down trees, make bricks, hammer iron without love. But you cannot deal with men without it, just as one cannot deal with bees without being careful. If you deal carelessly with bees, you will injure them, and will yourself be injured, and so with men. It cannot be otherwise, because natural love is the fundamental law of human life. It is true that a man cannot force another to love him, as he can force him to work for him, but it does not follow that a man may deal with men without love, especially to demand anything from them. If you feel no love, sit still, Nekhludoff thought. Occupy yourself with things, with yourself, with anything you like, only not with men. You can only eat without injuring yourself when you feel inclined to eat. So you can only deal with men usefully when you love. Only let yourself deal with a man without love, as I did yesterday with my brother-in-law, and there are no limits to the suffering you will bring on yourself, as all my life proves. Yes, it is so, thought Nekhludoff. It is good. Yes, it is good, he repeated, enjoying the freshness after the torturing heat, and conscious of having attained to the fullest clearness on a question that had long occupied him. End of Book 2, Chapter 40.